Hello, my name is Dr. Lewis Hoffman of Saybrook University, and this lecture today is a very brief introduction to international psychology. This is being developed for a class on international psychology, but is placed in open access on the web. What I'm going to do with this lecture is I'm going to briefly talk about my own history and work with international psychology. I'll talk a little bit about indigenous psychology, which is an important concept within international psychology, and the value and role of international psychology, particularly for those not necessarily doing international psychology. And then the primary portion of this brief introduction will be on engaging in international psychology work. So my own history with international psychology. When I was in graduate school, international work was not something that I had given any thought to doing, and even into my early career. It was not something that I had really given much consideration to. Diversity and multiculturalism, however, became a very important part of my professional career and something that I focused a lot of attention on. Also, I married a woman from a different country, and so being in a bicultural relationship pushed me to think much more about international issues relevant to psychology, but still hadn't really engaged in international psychology until I was invited to participate in a psychology of religion conference in China. And this was, we believe, the first psychology of religion conference in China. And so it was a very new thing that was happening, a very exciting thing to be a part of as this got started. It was also very instructive to me, and it helped develop a frame of reference for doing international psychology work as I engaged in this. And I'm particularly appreciative of Al Duick and Han Buxin, who were the two individuals that were leading the Psychology of Religion conference, because they were able to really provide a wonderful foundation and approach to doing international work. Doing international work around the psychology of religion is also a good place to start in many ways, because religion often has carried a lot of the indigenous psychology, a lot of the psychological ideas in many cultures, religion and also at times philosophy. The same was true in the history of Western psychology, that psychology developed in many ways in philosophy departments and was carried some by religion before psychology became its own independent discipline. So in working with the psychology of religion, really we're able to look at some of the indigenous ideas about healing, indigenous ideas about the self, indigenous ideas about personal growth and introspection and understanding oneself, and looking at how the religions that had a role in the development of Chinese history played a role in this. So this was a nice personal foundation for me. And from there, I met Mark Yang and some others that were interested in existential psychology, and we began doing some work around existential psychology in China. And so this is really where I got my start, is in the psychology of religion and existential psychology, and since I've done some work in other places, including participating in some conferences in the Caribbean and doing some training in Mexico as well. Indigenous psychology, I think, is one of the most central ideas to be aware of when doing international psychology work. It's I think, hard and maybe even dangerous to do international work without having some familiarity with this idea of indigenous psychology. For a number of years, I've served on the Indigenous Psychology Task Force with the Society of Humanistic Psychology, which is Division 32 of APA. And this task force was begun and is really championed by Louise Sanjarajan. And she's developed a website that has a number of resources on it that I would encourage you to check out. But I drew from this website some of the ideas about indigenous psychology. And this is directly quoted from the website. Indigenous psychology is an intellectual movement across the globe based on the following factors: a reaction against the colonization hegemony of Western psychology. Well, this is really critical when doing international work. psychology as a discipline as it is typically recognized in the West emerged very much from Western philosophy, Western ideas, Western values that doesn't necessarily fit all the cultures around the world. But yet often when psychologists have gone to other countries, they've not given much consideration to the differences and imposed a Western approach to psychology. And these can be quite significant. Let me just give one example. The concept of the self is very different in the West and in the East. In the West, although there's some change around this that's going on in the field now, there's often been this idea of of self-esteem, and there's been a lot of focus on the individual self. Building up the self is very central in a lot of Western psychology, and there's a lot of assumptions about the self. When you look at many Eastern cultures, there's a different push that the self is not so central and the culture is more central. And even the understanding of oneself is much more as oneself as being part of a community. So there's very different foundations and frame of references here that is implicit in so much of Western psychology and just doesn't fit certain cultures. Thus, there's the need to do certain adaptations if the approach is going to fit at all. So the colonization of Western psychology is really this idea of imposing a Western psychology across the world. And you do see this in a number of different countries where this has strongly occurred. The need for non-Western cultures to solve their local problems through indigenous practice and applications. So this is looking at forms of healing that are already indigenous, that are already there. So I talked before about the idea of the psychology of religion and looking at religious beliefs and religious philosophies as carrying a lot of the early psychologies within different cultures. So if you look, for example, in China, you can see in Confucianism, in Buddhism, a lot of the foundations for the indigenous ways of healing, indigenous approaches to healing that can be found within China. And so being able to look to these and how these can be used, how these can be employed is very important. So one, we don't impose upon other countries. Two, we look for healing approaches that are already there, already existent and consistent with the beliefs and values of the culture. And three, the need for non-Western culture to recognize itself in the constructs and practices of psychology. And I talked about this some with that first point, that the ideas and values of Western psychology are very implicit, and we have to be able to recognize these values. We have to recognize the values that are part of Western psychology and not just assume that there's some universal truths out there, which is often done. Four, the need to use indigenous philosophies and concepts to generate theories of global discourse. So bringing these into the way that we do global discourse and also into the global discourse is also quite important. So this is some of the idea of indigenous psychology. Now it could be argued then, and has been argued, that at least to a degree, all psychologies are indigenous. So that, in other words, all psychologies develop and emerge from within a particular cultural context. And so they have to be indigenous to some degree. It needs to be considered then, what is the role of psychologies that are not indigenous for particular cultures? So what is the role of Western psychologies for China, for Japan, for India, for Ghana, for all these other countries that maybe don't have some of the same values and beliefs? Is it even appropriate for us to introduce these to other cultures? This is, I think, a question that's important to keep in mind, though I'm not going to attempt to answer it right now. Next, let's just real briefly talk about the value and role of international psychology for doing more local work. So in the context of this course, I'm teaching this course at a university in the United States, primarily to individuals that are from the United States or planning to practice and do their professional work within the United States, although we do have a number of international students as well. So just using that as an example, what is the value of international psychology for those that live in the United States, never plan on doing international psychology work? I think it's still quite important. And there are some movements to international psychology, internationalize psychology in general, including a couple of textbooks out there written with this focus to it. Well, a few of the values of international psychology for those not doing this work includes that it helps one do local, multicultural, and diversity work. When I first started doing work in China, I was amazed at how much it opened up my understanding of some of the assumptions that I did not recognize when working with a lot of clients within the United States. And I think that as a therapist and as a teacher, I became a much better therapist and a much better teacher, particularly in terms of working with diversity through the international work I was doing and through the international awareness that I was developing. So I think it helps one do local psychology much better in terms of multiculturalism and diversity, but not just in terms of those. It's essential for working with immigrant populations, people who have come from other countries to live in the United States. That I think often what psychologists have done in working with people that have immigrated to the United States is they've focused on pushing them to acculturate instead of taking a more balanced approach that helps people decide how they want to acculturate and if they want to acculturate and what they want to keep from their own values and their own culture. This broadens the scope of psychology when we do international work. There's much that has not been considered in Western psychology that is much more of a focus in other cultures. And so it broadens the scope and helps us think differently. I've already talked about how it helps us recognize our bias and limitations, and it also promotes a more flexible understanding of the self in psychology. Several years ago, I wrote an article with some colleagues about myths of self that was published in the Journal of Humanistic Psychology, and now it's going to be in the second edition of the Handbook of Humanistic Psychology as well. And one of the focuses of this was looking at the challenges to the idea of the self, particularly in terms of the history of Western psychology. And so we did not a comprehensive, because that would take several books, not an article, but we did a history of the self in Western thought, and looking at the diversity of understandings of the self just in Western thought to a degree, but then also as we enter postmodern times where a lot of people are arguing that there really is no essential self, or that we have multiple selves. And then we looked at an international perspective some too. And where we really came down to at the end was that the assumption of self that is implicit throughout much of Western psychology, it is very important for a lot of people, but it's not the only view of the self. And the view of the self and the understanding of the self that is going to be the healthiest for different individuals really depends a lot upon the individual and their cultural background. So we should not impose particular views of the self or particular views of what the healthy self is even upon people from different cultures, but instead take a more adaptable approach. Looking at international psychology, we can really get to a sense of how we can broaden our understanding of the self. But I think there's also, when we engage in dialogue, there's quite a bit that we learn from each other. As we've done work in China around existential psychology, for example, we have identified what could be considered some indigenous Chinese existential psychologies. And basically what these are is that they are indigenous Chinese ideas and theories that have been adapted into approaches to psychology that could be considered existential in the sense that they share a lot of the values. Now, the way that I understand existential psychology, I think this fits with this approach particularly well. Within existential psychology, you're going to see that there's a lot of different ideas of what existential psychology are. There are different approaches to it. It's not a unified approach. But across those different approaches, what you'll see is there's a number of values and approaches and ideas that tend to be endorsed by a majority of existential psychologists and therapists. Not any therapist will agree to all of these values necessarily, and you don't need to ascribe to all of them to be considered an existential therapist, but rather the tendent to be identified as existential, one tends to be in agreement with a large number of these values. And so these approaches that are indigenous Chinese share a lot of these values, and therefore could rightly be considered indigenous Chinese approaches to existential psychology. Now, as we've dialogued between these, and the one that in particular we focused on dialoguing with is a Germian approach to therapy, which was developed by Shui-Fu Wang, based on the writing of Lu Xun. As we've dialogued between Germian therapy and existential therapy, there's a lot that we've learned from each other. There's ways that it's advanced Western existential psychology and the ways that it's helped advance Germian, not by imposing upon one another, but by engaging in dialogue and learning from each other. And that's a critical difference. It's not imposing, it's dialogue and learning from each other in ways that are consistent with one's own indigenous value system. So there's a lot of value in many ways of international psychology beyond doing international psychology work. Okay, so now we shift to beginning to talk about engaging in international psychology work. First, and probably most important, one must consider the intentions of doing international work. During the time in China, I've also seen this in many other cultures through stories and also firsthand examples. It seems like there's a lot of people that go in with an attitude that is not beneficial to doing international psychology work. And on this slide, there's a number of common problematic reasons for doing, or motivations for doing international work. And this first one is incredibly common: to help other countries by bringing in a superior approach to them. This is not a healthy attitude for a number of reasons. One, this idea of a superior approach, and I don't think that many would use that language, but yet I think that really reflects what they're doing, is they think of Western psychology that comes from the United States as being more developed, and so and being researched, and so they feel justified in taking it and imposing it on another culture. Now, I also put the idea of help and them in quotations marks here. This idea of them, it really has this us-them type mentality to it, and this is the way a lot of people do international psychology work, unfortunately, is they see the people they're going to help as them, instead of something where it becomes a we, where we're collaborating together. And this idea of helping them then really reflects an attitude that's problematic. Another reason is to draw people to one's approach to psychology or other worldviews through the work. Now, this is often a temptation, and this is one that I try to be very cognizant of myself, because I'm very passionate about existential psychology. It's something that's been very important in my life. It's been a big part of my career and professional identity, but also part of my personal identity. It's something I deeply believe in. And so it's very easy for me at times to believe that this really is the right approach. But when I sit back and reflect, my values really are that I think that all the different psychologies have something to value, and they reflect different cultural differences, they reflect different values differences. And so it's important to find the approach to psychology that really fits with your values. As a professor, I've often encouraged this to students, to not too quickly choose a therapy orientation as one begins to become a therapist, but to really look at the different approaches and see which fits with their values. And when you find the approach to therapy that best fits with your values, you're probably going to be the most effective therapist when you do an approach to therapy that fits with your values and your passions, not the approach that you feel compelled by some other reasons or you were convinced to take on as your identity. So I think we have to be very careful here, and this becomes even more important when doing international work, because the values get much more complicated. So while going to China and other places to talk about existential therapy, I'm always very cognizant of this and try to keep it at the front of my awareness. And then to promote one's work or oneself to an international audience. This I've seen quite a bit, and it's quite disturbing and disheartening at times that people want to go and do international work just to be able to look good, in essence, to promote oneself. And this type of attitude, once again, I don't think is a great attitude for doing it, for doing this type of work. Okay, so some better reasons to learn about indigenous wisdom from other cultures. And this is a good starting place. When I go to China each year, I try to bring students along, and typically what I encourage is the first time going on the trip to focus primarily on learning. And then if they choose to come back a second time, then we get more active in some of the training aspects of what we do. But I think it's very helpful to begin indigenous work with this attitude of learning. To exchange ideas and learn from each other. Again, this is that collaborative approach where we learn from each other. That I do hope that when I go to China, that what I've learned may be of some value, but to people in China. But I don't want to be in the position to decide what is going to be of value. Present the ideas in the process of a dialogue and exchange, and I encourage critique of the ideas, encourage consideration of how ideas may need to be adapted, but really the idea is to leave the power for the decision in the hands of the people from the culture to decide what is going to be the most useful and what is not useful. Another better reason is to help and or serve others through a collaborative approach that values the indigenous approaches and wisdom. So there can very much be the desire to help others and to serve others, but when it's based in a collaborative approach instead of a hierarchical approach or a superiority approach, it's much more respectful and I believe much more helpful. Okay, in engaging in international work, preparations are really important. In addition to taking students, I also work with two people in China, Shui-Fu Wang and Mark Yang, on providing an international conference in existential psychology every other year. And so this requires a lot of preparations for the conference, but part of that is also preparing people that are coming to the conference. So we provide information to people about China, about the culture, about presenting in China, about working with translation, many different things that all become a part of this. Now, part of it is the technical aspects, which can be food, and food can be challenging, particularly with dietary restrictions. Working with translation, this can be something that's difficult to adapt to, and then there's also the logistics such as hotel, travel, visas, all of those things. While these are important, they really are only a small part of the preparations. I think it's important to have some type of invitation, and when someone that's hosting, that there's just something in the approach to that I think is very advantageous. With the conference, a lot of times it's the conference that's inviting people, but we really look critically at the submissions to make sure that they are something that we believe is appropriate to be presented, not just at an international conference, but at an international conference in China. It's important to learn about the culture in advance, but it's also important to recognize that what one can learn in advance is very limited, and more learning will be required while there. No amount of studying about China, if you've grown up in the United States, can ever prepare you to go and spend a week in China. There's much you have to be just prepared to be thrown into, and the same would be true in going to Ghana, going to Mexico, to Brazil, to different countries. While And it's very different going to these locations on a vacation and going there to do work such as international psychology work. So preparation is one, learning, but two, cultivating an attitude of being open to learning more. One must prepare to be out of one's comfort zones and how to respond appropriately, physically, psychologically, also professionally. And Michael Moats and Trent Claypool and Elizabeth Saxon a few years ago wrote a wonderful article in the Humanistic Psychologist that I think gets at some of this, both the value and the challenges of this being out of one's comfort zone. And for some people, getting out of that comfort zone physically makes it very difficult to do the other work and to remain open in other ways. So preparing for that is quite important. And then be prepared to ask questions and learn. So that learning attitude again. So these are all important aspects, not all inclusive, but important aspects of the preparations. For students going, we generally go through, have them sit through, when first deciding to apply, a PowerPoint slide presentation that explains a lot of this, and then we have a meeting in advance as well as a lot of email exchange talking about how to prepare for the trip. Then engaging in international psychology. Relationships are foundational, and this is something that has really been emphasized to me by a number of people. Al Duick, I think, really modeled this in many ways, but in particular, Mark Yang is the individual that talks about this constantly. And he will talk about how you can spend a lot of time investing in and working on something and building a collaborative project, but if there's not that relationship there, it often doesn't come into fruition. And so building those relationships really is an essential foundation to being able to do effective work. When engaging and when beginning these relationships, it's good to expect suspicion. This, I think, is good and healthy in many situations, particularly if you coming from the United States and as well as some other countries that have a history a lot of times of coming in with an attitude of imposition, of imposing our approach, coming in with an idea of our approach is better and not being respectful of the culture. And so the suspicion here is important. I've been doing work in China for, I believe, about 7 or 8 years now, and built a number of relationships. And early on, certainly saw some of that suspicion. But over time, because I've built the relationships, haven't experienced as much. This last year, I was invited to go to a conference where it was very different. I didn't know a lot of the people there, and they hadn't heard of me and weren't familiar with the work that I had done. And so I quickly recognized that there was some more suspicion with a lot of people about why I was there and what I really had to offer. And I noticed in myself a desire to want to be defensive in ways and to say, hey, I've been doing this and been doing it in the right way for a long time. But that wouldn't have been very helpful and actually probably would have interfered and created a lot more suspicion. Instead, recognize that the suspicion is a normal, healthy part of the process when working with people that we're not familiar with from different cultures, particularly when there's some of the challenge in history between the cultures. So expecting this and going in prepared to not be defensive about this is important. And then building a good relationship with the host and the other collaborators is important. Building this relationship can help generalize to some of the other relationships. It's important to show respect for the local wisdom and indigenous approaches, demonstrating this in different ways, being able to identify places that are valuable and where it fits, asking questions, asking for feedback. All of these things really help. Asking for critique, and I'm generally very explicit, particularly when speaking to a crowd that I'm not familiar with and haven't worked with before. I generally always try and begin by saying that although I've been doing work internationally for some time, There's still a lot of things that I'm learning, and I view that it is something I'll be learning throughout my lifetime. And so I encourage feedback on what works and doesn't work, and critique. That really emphasizing that they are the experts on their culture, much more than I am, and are better able to evaluate what fits, what doesn't fit, what needs to be adapted. Being very explicit about this at the outset often helps to build some of that trust and build a relationship, but it needs to be followed up by demonstrating that you're actually doing this. And what I've seen with some people is they start off with saying something like this, but then as soon as they receive critique or feedback from the audience, become very defensive, and that, again, that doesn't help out build the relationships. Working collaboratively to adjust the approaches. So when something is recognized that, well, this isn't going to fit with many people from this country, engaging in people who are from the culture and how might this be adapted, or does this just need to be taken out of the approach? Taking that collaborative approach is important instead of assuming responsibility for making the adaptations yourself. And then your attitude and frame to developing relationships will be key and primary. That what are the relationships for? Why are they valuable to you? Okay, we've talked quite a bit about this, but I wanted to be a little bit more explicit about the do not impose. And one of these areas is ethics, and Mark Yang will talk much more about this, but let me just mention one thing. The ethics codes that have been developed in the United States and other Western countries, while they may be a good fit for those countries, I think they need critique quite often from within those countries yet, they often do not fit very well with other countries. Now, I'll give one example of this, and then I'll let Mark talk about this much more. In one place that was presenting one time, we had gone basically to listen, and they were asked to present. And towards the end, they asked for a demonstration, which we did. And it was a very challenging and difficult client. And so after the demonstration, we were talking some, and one of the things that came up in the conversation when they asked what might I do different, and if it wasn't just a demonstration, and said, well, might just go for a walk with the person instead of sitting in the therapy room. Now in the United States, there's lots of issues about confidentiality, risk management, all those things that need to be considered. But this was a very rural part of China. It's a very different situation. And the person that was doing the demonstration with was quite shocked, and as we talked about it some more, she said, well, that's what I do with this client. But before, when I've told that to people coming in from the West, they've always told me that that's wrong and that you can't do that and it's dangerous to do that. And I felt very ashamed that I do this, so I didn't want to tell you this. But again, that's imposing our ethics from the United States on people in China to say you've got to do it in the same way, that it's got to be the 50-minute hour in this private room. Which, again, even in the United States may need adaptation a lot of times, but to impose this in other cultures just doesn't work, particularly cultures that have no conception of what counseling and therapy is in many regions, such as was the case in this example. Okay, so values. Again, we've got to look at the values of our approaches, and I'm very disturbed that in the West we don't very often talk about what are the values associated with the different psychological theories. But there are significant value differences. Let me just give an example. That within certain approaches to therapy, such as many cognitive behavioral approaches, there is a very strong implicit valuing of being rational, and of being rational and not overly emotional. And that's a value, that's part of it. Now, people can adapt these cognitive therapies in many ways to be more inclusive of the value of emotions. But that is a value system that's implicit in much of cognitive therapies, that we use our reason to control our emotions. Whereas in an existential approach, we value the rational and non-rational ways of knowing, the emotional ways of knowing. That emotions is an important part of our epistemology, or knowing about ourselves, knowing about our experience. And so emotions are looked at very differently. And reason is not necessarily given such a privileged place over emotions as it is within some other theories. Well, we have to be able to recognize these types of values that are implicit in our theories when doing international work, to be able to see and recognize when it does or may not fit with these other cultures. So values is important. Methods. And one of the challenges with an existential approach in China, is that in China there often is a very hierarchical approach to relationships. And in the approach that I take to existential therapy, it's not very hierarchical. But that can be a point of challenge, and a point where some adaptations need to be made there. So the methods often need to be adapted. Within an existential approach in the United States, often I will be looking for more of a evident expression of emotion, because that's more common in the United States, particularly certain cultures in the United States. Whereas in some other cultures, including China, the more outward expression of emotion is much more muted. It's not that they don't experience emotions or feel emotions or have emotions, which is a bias or a stereotype that many people in the West have about people from China, but that they experience them and share them in a bit of a different way. And so my methods of going about working with emotions when working in the United States is quite different than when doing work in China. And the work in China I do is primarily in the form of demonstrations, but still been working across the years to make some adaptations to that. And then again, the theories, which often are inclusive of the values and methods. We don't want to impose these. One must be aware of the implicit values and continually looking for implicit values that they were not aware of before, to avoid imposing them. Okay, and often again, these are hidden in our theories and we may not recognize them at first. Now, where this can be really challenging is when others may appear to be taking in the ideas uncritically, or believing that your way must be better because you're the outside expert. And I've encountered this a number of times, and there's a challenge here to try and step out of that and say, well, I'm not really the expert, can be something that's seen as stepping out of the cultural expectations in ways too. So there's kind of this paradox here about this. And so when there seems to be the receptivity to values being imposed or being looked at uncritically, it can be a challenge. And at times this requires to step back and really look at the relationship and the context, and to work towards a perspective where it's less likely that the values are going to be imposed upon the other culture. In the end, if people from other cultures choose to take in these values, there's not a lot that we can do about it, but we can encourage that idea of recognizing that typically theories do need to be adapted and critiqued before implemented in a different culture. Okay. Engaging in international psychology teaching. Well, we begin by acknowledging the differences. I mentioned before that I always start off asking for critique, asking for help in identifying what doesn't work, asking for help in identifying what needs to be adapted, and asking for feedback on what from the indigenous culture can be integrated into the approach. So I think this is really key, and I strongly prefer, when doing any type of teaching in an international context, to do it collaboratively, and really try to avoid doing it without this. So when I go around presenting around China, it's typically in collaboration with Mark Yang, Fu Wang, or occasionally other people that I know from China who can bring in that perspective, and I know we have the relationship. And coming back to this, what we talked about before, about imposing the values when people tend to be taking it in uncritically, or having this kind of idealization of you as the outside expert. Teaching collaboratively can be a very powerful way of working with this, so that I can ask Mark for critique and feedback. I can ask Mark for help about this, or I can ask Sui Fu what doesn't fit, and can you help me recognize this? And as we model that in our interactions together, and as we model the dialogue, that helps to avoid that. The other thing is Mark and Sui Fu can readily integrate in. So it builds this collaborative approach of working together that really establishes that valuing of the indigenous ideas that they're able to bring. So it's I think the collaborative frame really can be powerful in this teaching modality. Then practice when doing therapy, consultation, other type of work. Seek out consultation now, including seeking out consultation on your consultation. So if you're consulting with the business, or you're consulting with a department, for example, in some of the trips I've consulted with psychology departments, or psychology of religion departments at universities, or at times with businesses in China as well, or their counseling department within businesses. When doing this type of consulting work, again, you need to seek out the consultation and feedback, which is often, pulling back and checking in with someone from the culture. So that really is important. It's important to seek out feedback from the client, which is someone seeking out from the audience when teaching. Again, establishing that collaborative frame. Now, that might look different in different cultures because of some of the values within the culture. For example, that hierarchical culture may look a little bit different. Need to be aware of that. And then be vigilant for looking what may not fit or be working. This is something that I think is important when teaching and doing therapy and consultation in general. That with a lot of times when working with clients from the same cultural background, I may say something and I'll see a client kind of furrow their brow, and it's evident that it didn't seem like it fit. But if I don't say something or notice that, often the client may not as well. And so recognizing and be alert to when there might be points of disagreement or when it may not fit, and then trying to softly and sensitively find a way to discuss this is quite important. Okay. So in conclusion, some of the essential points that we talked about, just highlighting them once again: build those relationships. The relationships are key. The respect, the mutual respect is foundational. Going in with an attitude of superiority just doesn't work and is not helpful, and often does harm. Recognizing one's limitations and knowledge, the limitation in what one brings from one's own knowledge and expertise and skills is very critical. Encouraging the critique, and we've talked about quite a bit, and then engaging in dialogue. That it's really about the dialogue. And the work that I do in international psychology, these are really the things that I try to always keep at the forefront. And when I'm able to keep these at the forefront, more often than not, feel like we're able to do some really great work together and learn from each other and benefit from each other. So that's the conclusion of this lecture. Hopefully this has helped you get a bit of a frame for international psychology, and maybe get you excited about what international psychology is and can offer in your career. Thank you.